Welcome to the Intrinsically Ordered podcast. Today, I'm joined by Colin in studio this time, from wherever you're from, such as Narnia or wherever. Mm-hmm. He has traveled here to another mythical place that doesn't exist. And today we're going to be talking about Catholic sacraments. This one will get a little complex, maybe a little spicy, but I think a unique critique that we're going to bring.
We'll try.
So the simple thesis, if you guys just want to cut to the chase, is that there is nothing supernatural about Catholic sacraments. They're just complicated human rituals pretending to have divine power. In the significantly more complicated version is that Catholic sacraments claim to be supernatural channels of grace, but there's nothing magical, extraordinary, or even necessary about them. They're just man-made rituals, full of rules, contradictions, and other theater, depending on who's listening, with no evidence they actually do anything. The first thing that we should probably get out there is that we're not Protestants. We're not leveling Protestant objections.
No.
Colin, do you want to intro both of us? I realize we probably should have done that sooner. And that we're not some rabid Protestants on the internet.
Yeah, we are both, I guess, depending on your definition, current/ex Catholics, depending on how you view indelible marks, which is relevant to our sacramental discussion today. But yeah, we both grew up Catholic. We both had our, dip into traditionalism. Mine much more sort of long-term, I think, than yours.
Colin was stuck with it growing up. I decided to join it, but we were both traditional Catholics. I think learned a catechism or two, and we're not like Googling random Protestant blogs for this. So
no.
Well, a lot of times, like, the critiques of Catholic sacraments are, like,
yes,
from Protestants, where they're like, well, the problem isn't that they're not evidence, it's just, like, the Bible doesn't say. In this case, we're just making an argument around they don't seem to exist from just from an empirical standpoint. They seem to have no effect.
Well, I think there's a few different points of critique that we want to talk about. First is the practical point that the Church says that these are the official efficacious pathways of God's grace that are given through the Church, and that they will have a measurable, well, they don't say measurable because they don't like that word, but a significant actual impact on your life. They will improve, for example, they say that if you're struggling with certain sins, frequent attendance of Mass and reception of communion will help overcoming sins, because it's sort of the best direct access to God's grace, and God's grace is what you need to overcome sort of habitual sins, things like that. Or confirmation will strengthen your resolve and your ability, like the 7 gifts of the Holy Ghost are tangible, concrete mental tools that you are given supposedly by the sacrament. And so the contention is that none of this is actually observable when you look at the data, when you look at anecdotally or in terms of actual analysis of like Catholic populations. You don't actually see the promised results. So that's one critique of the sacraments. Second critique is that at the Council of Trent, they established the 7 sacraments in form and matter and declared that they were all founded by Christ, and that there are 7 of them, and there are no more than 7, and there will never be more than 7, and that they are sort of in perpetuity. These are the sacraments, and they were founded by Christ directly.
Perennial institutions in some sense.
And that's, depending on your interpretation of the idea of development of doctrine, that it's just not a historically viable stance to take, that these sacraments were laid out by Christ in anything that we would recognize today as the 7 sacraments. So that's, I would say, the second point of critique. And I would say the third point is that the sacraments aren't unique in any sort of religious sense. I think Catholics like to think of themselves as, being different from other religions in the way that they practice or engage with the supernatural, and especially through the sacraments. They view them as somehow different from other ritual practices and other religious beliefs, but that's fundamentally just not the case. So those are sort of the 3 avenues I want to go down.
In our big disclaimer here, if a Catholic is listening, our critique is not that many Catholics find sacraments meaningful.
Sure.
Our critique isn't that you can't have an experience of the sacraments. Oh, yeah. Our critique is that they only work insofar as the person believes that they work. And so it would be fair to call it a placebo effect, not in a derogatory way, but that specifically who we're talking to is not just some random Catholic mom that loves going to Mass on the weekend.
Yes.
There's a very specific strain of Catholics, a lot of those who have studied this issue formally, that say, like, the only normative the only normative way to heaven is through the sacraments, that other denominations and other religions, rituals are invalid or ran by demons, that they often coerce or shame family members into partaking in these sacraments because they put them in such high esteem, or people that say that there is nothing else out there from other religions that even comes close to this idea. And like we said, you can find them meaningful in the same way that there's so many things that we all find meaningful in our lives that when you go to, for example, to grandma's house, you might have your own set of rituals that you do to greet her. And so it's not that those aren't meaningful to you, but what we're saying here is that these aren't divinely ordained, nor do they seem to do anything apart from insofar as you believe. Anything else we want to hit on our disclaimer?
I guess, to piggyback off of that, I mean, I personally am a big believer in the usefulness of ritual of all kinds as a way to sort of regulate mental and physical health, and especially community cohesion and community health. And I think what I would say is, like, yeah, we're not trying to say that these are bad things to do necessarily, or that they're somehow, oh, if you had a good time, or they help you in some way, that, oh, well, you're wrong or you're making it up. Obviously not. The idea is just that they're not different from other kinds of ritual. The benefits that you get from them are the same benefits that you would get from any sort of community rituals that are encoded and reified through continual usage by a community. So, and
then we should also do a quick crash course for people that are listening who aren't super familiar with the Catholic idea of sacraments. And let's see, probably the best way to explain this is like formalized rituals that Catholics believe came directly from Jesus when he was on earth, and that aren't just symbolic. Like a lot of times if you go to a Protestant church, they might talk about the Last Supper or their form of communion as ritual, and they make it meaningful or they make it impactful. But Catholics have this different conception, which is that Jesus literally instituted these visible signs that we know grace is conferred in them, and that, for example, on baptism, it's not just a sign of you becoming Christian, but that your soul has this indelible mark, that something ontological truly happens. Same thing with Eucharist, where it's Mass or whatever it is, that it is literally Jesus.
Yes, no indelible mark for the Eucharist.
Yeah, no indelible mark for that.
The idea that the language that's used is that they're visible signs of an invisible grace. And also the word efficacious is important, because it's through the act of conducting the ritual of the sacrament, the grace is conferred automatically through that act. It's essentially, you don't have to be in a certain state of mind as the priest or whoever you are baptizing someone. You don't have to be in a particular state to confer the sacrament necessarily. The sacrament works by its own power because it's been given to us by Christ as a direct channel of grace by God. That's the idea of what a sacrament is.
Yeah, and in Catholics, these sacraments are also very rule heavy. That your average Catholic's not going to know all of the rules that go into these sacraments. But whether you're studying to become a priest or you just go down the rabbit hole of how these sacraments are supposed to happen, because they are objective, that even if the priest doesn't have perfect intention, even if there's nobody else around, that this divine mystery is made present in the Eucharist, or that with anointing of the sick, it's not just a blessing, that something happens there regardless of what people think. And so our problem isn't that people think that things happen, or that because people think that things happen, they change their life. Our problem is that, like, in this vacuum view of the sacraments, that something truly happens apart from a human understanding. And so in these rule-heavy things, you have form, matter, and intent. Which, depending on the sacrament, there's kind of like three different things that you can pull on. So with the Eucharist, you have to, the weekend Mass, communion, whatever you want to call it, has to have unleavened bread specifically. There has to be the right physical things.
It doesn't have to be unleavened, depends on the rite.
Yes, the Roman rite.
Yeah, the Roman rite. So I think, I don't actually know the list, but the form of the words of consecration are important. The bread and the wine are important, and priest has to be the one doing it, I believe, are the conditions. I could be wrong.
In this could be a whole other rabbit hole looking at these rules, but on even just one sacrament, there are so many hypotheticals, so many, you have to read the correct words, you have to do the correct things, and even if you believe that you did the thing, there's still this underlying reality that we might not have access to. But at the end of the day, to kind of set the stakes here, is that sacraments are objective, that sacraments really happen, and that especially in Catholic life are once again talking specifically about the Eucharist, it is the source and summit of the Catholic faith, and that these sacraments, depending on which ones, are mandatory. They're not just signs, they're not just things that you ask your pastor for, but that these have to happen under normal conditions. Yes, and then so if you're Catholic watching and what we're talking about doesn't make sense, like, you're probably not going to get the rest of this episode, but we just want to set the stakes that we're talking about these necessary, objective things that communicate grace, and that Catholics write so poetically about the sacraments, that they're life-changing, they're life-giving. You're getting all of this grace from them, that we have these incredible mysteries. It's like the stakes in this conversation can't be set high enough, because in Catholic life they are so important.
Without the sacraments, it's almost like the church doesn't have most of the function that it has without the sacraments. Because in a way, yes, the church is there to safeguard doctrine and to bring the community of Christ together and to be one body. But I think a lot of what the church does functionally for Catholics is provide sacraments to them, provide them access to God's grace through these 7 approved channels. We should probably list what they are just for people.
Yes. So we got baptism, we have the Eucharist, we have confirmation, reconciliation or confession, anointing of the sick, marriage, and holy orders. So there's 7 concrete, fleshed out, adjudicated, complex rituals for a number of steps along your path. Some of them happen once, like you can only be baptized once. Some of them come in parts and pieces like holy orders. There's kind of 3 levels to it. And so you can receive it thrice, but technically it's just like a continuation of the first one.
Right.
Versus like you can receive communion technically twice a day. Only one has to be in Mass.
Yep.
Let's see.
You have to receive it once a year.
Yes. Same thing with confession. Is it once a year that you have to do it?
For communion, you have to receive communion during Eastertide. Confession is just once a year.
Oh, yeah. So you're after the races. Anointing the sick is a little bit different, where it's a cool thing, but it's not necessary, but also like everybody stresses themselves to death. And so all of these sacraments have such ornate rules and understandings and different forms between different types of Catholic churches. And maybe the first point as we dive into some of our critiques here is that, one, the burden of proof is wild. Like you're expected to believe that a specific individual has been ordained by a particular God to do a particular sacrament at a particular time with a particular person. That if you think about the burden of proof, if I'm a priest here and we're going to confession, like I have to prove that God exists, that Jesus was God, that Jesus instituted the church, that I can trace my lineage as a priest back to, through the bishops, back to Jesus, and that I was validly ordained, and that we also have the correct understanding of how confession works, and that also the church has the correct understanding of how to forgive sins or give me the power to forgive sins on God's behalf. And you're like, that is a wild thing to have to prove. And so when Catholics are like, well, there's beauty out there in the world, it's like there's like 25 million steps between an argument from motion to like you have to confess. And there's these rubrics around like what you have to confess and what you don't have to confess, and how many you have to say the name, the number, and the kind of sin, and any aggregating factors. It's just like a huge burden of proof.
I think it also it's escalated even so because of the fact that they're efficacious, and which means that they confer grace through themselves.
They work.
The church has to be very particular about form and matter. So any particular required element, if it's off, the whole sacrament doesn't work, because it's not just about intention or willing something. It's literally the form and the matter have to be exact for it to literally confer the grace. Obviously, I know we were going to talk about this at some point, but they still hold that God is obviously sovereign and free to give grace however and whenever and to whomever he wants at any time. The sacraments themselves, for them to work, they have to be exact. And so that level of proof is insane. Having to be like, yes, this exact word order is the proper way to do this. Like, how do we know this? Where did we find this? And it's a whole rabbit hole.
And maybe another way to explain sacraments is that if you had like an ontological metal detector, that like you could, like if the average Christian might understand, like if I'm trying to figure out if Colin's Christian, I just have to like ask him and figure out what he really believes. In the Catholic understanding, if you had like a soul detector and there's a screen here and I don't even know a person's there, I'm going to wave my soul detector and there's going to be nothing, and it's going to go beep, 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 beep right over Colin because he has an indelible mark on his soul, which means like our souls as in soul, the body soul composites, that like when you're baptized or ordained or receive confirmation, that there's like this mark on your invisible soul that can never go away, but is objective. We might not be able to have access to it, but like it's really there, as like we're proving like nuances of a nuance of a debate.
Theoretically, the idea from a Catholic understanding is say a machine existed, like you said, that could like detect supernatural traits, and you analyzed a host after a priest did the consecration. You would be able to tell if it had worked, or if the priest had done it correctly and it was actually the body of Christ, because it would be ontologically different because of the sacrament. Or you could scan a soul and say, oh, this confession worked because they're no longer in a state of mortal sin. Like, okay, there's a difference here in the supernatural quality of the soul. They are claiming something in sort of Platonic sense of true realism, that these souls have actual objective qualities that are different and changed by these sacraments. And so obviously they're not claiming that we can observe these things, but in a hypothetical where we could, they would claim that yes, there would be observable differences.
And then also, even in the afterlife, these marks stay with your soul, that in hell, a priest is going to have this mark on him, and same thing in heaven. And so kind of like the first one is just the burden of proof is wild on this. Kind of our second thing that we had mentioned at the start is that sacraments are framed as these massive sources of grace, yet they seem to have no measurable effect apart from insofar as somebody believes. So there's no real world effect unless you already believe. They're practically absurd. They're untestable and unverifiable. Right, like we talked about, there's this reality to them, but also we can't know that reality, but yet it's nonetheless real. And yeah, it's so like Catholics on average, statistically speaking, aren't these sources of supernatural grace. They don't have these crazy different rates of good things or bad things.
Yeah, for example, like there's certain, it's hard to get specific, I don't have specific data on Catholics versus general Christianity, but I know that like Christians give more to charity, but they don't have like a lower divorce rate. They don't have a lower, pretty much anything. Most people in prisons are religious. It's hard to argue exactly about data for this, because a Catholic might say, well, just because you're religious doesn't mean that you receive regular sacraments, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, I'm pretty sure we actually do have even data that people who attend like church regularly, there's certain markers where they might have certain behavior that we deem like more morally acceptable, but it's not a stark, oh wow, there's something happening here. There's not like, we should investigate this because it's clearly improving these people's lives. Like, no, not really. And just anecdotally, I know we have a mutual friend, plenty of mutual friends, honestly, who, because we're both gay, that's an experience we can like speak to a lot. There's a lot of people who are queer in the church who are sort of, continue receiving the sacraments. That will help you overcome your struggles with these sins. You'll be able to, the more you grow in holiness, the more you achieve, or you participate in sacraments, the more your struggles with sin will sort of become more manageable, because God, you will be more conformed to the image of God through this participation in the sacraments. And that just, I know so many people who have been like, no, that doesn't actually seem to be the case. And you're promising that it should be. And I'm doing everything I can, and it's not happening. It seems like there's an issue here.
Well, and if you have two Catholics that are both in a state of grace, if we both went to confession and received Eucharist this Sunday, but the priest had one consecrated host and one unconsecrated host, you would think if it's an objective reality with supernatural grace, that we could each receive a host, not knowing what the reality of it is, and then that week figure out like, dang, like you really have some supernatural grace this week.
Right.
And part of this is that if somebody says, oh, I go to Mass on the weekend and I feel better, I feel more at peace, I feel stronger. The question is like, well, that's because you believed. And so the difference doesn't have to be born in a supernatural explanation. As we talked in a societal level, like if you have a group that shames divorce and says divorce isn't allowed, we would expect them to have less divorce from a natural perspective.
Right.
Or if you say, well, somebody going to the gym is going to grow muscle. It's like, yeah, so there's a difference between people that lift weights and do cardio. But there's nothing supernatural. And so when Catholics talk about there is this incredible experience, or here's an anecdotal story about how it made me different, the question isn't, do you believe, or the question is that because you believed, or is it because of the objective reality? And you would expect, if somebody, I think like in an American context, if I go meet the president, I'm going to have so many emotions. I'm going to tell people all about it. It's going to feel special, but not because like the person of the president at any given time is something different, but that we've constructed government around and put this person into a place of importance.
Yes.
And so just because I have an experience of meeting a senator or a celebrity or the president, that can be explained naturally, if that's a helpful distinction for people listening.
Yeah, a lot of the benefits that you might find of So regular, for example, communion is a big one. They talk about communion a lot as regular participation in the Eucharist and the Mass is meant to sort of be the main tool that you have to sort of conform yourself to God. But you would expect for someone who is devout and finds meaning and purpose in religion to find themselves edified through regular participation in community ritual about that religion. I mean, it makes sense. If this is a meaningful thing to this person and they're going to group services where they are sharing this thing that is meaningful to them with other people, yes, from a secular perspective, there's nothing mysterious about finding that beneficial to your life. It's what we're saying is theoretically, I don't think this would ever happen because the church doesn't like doing these things. But if you say you were to do a study where you had people go to communion every day, throughout the week, and have a control group given unconsecrated hosts without their knowledge and a group given consecrated hosts, would you notice a difference in their quality of life? And it would be interesting to do that study. I would love to do that study. I would suspect that you would not find a difference. Yeah. I can't say that for sure, obviously, but it is something that theoretically should be borne out in that data. But I don't think that the church would ever want to do something like that.
Well, it's the same thing with confession, that a lot of times Catholics will talk about how they felt so guilty about everything. They felt like sin weighing on their soul. And then they went to confession, were able to verbalize this guilt and everything terrible that they've done, and hear a representative of who they think to be a representative of God say, "You are forgiven." And it's like, yeah, we're not saying people don't find it meaningful. It's just that we expect that if you're in a group that shames a particular behavior, you're going to feel shame. And then if there's a formalized, ritualized way of which you can free yourself from that guilt, that you're going to feel relief from it. And so both on the sacraments, and then there's a discussion overall that I'll probably have a video on, that there's nothing supernatural about religion. It's a natural phenomenon, or adoration. A lot of young Catholics love the experience. And the thing is, a young Catholic who, when the lights are off and there's all this cool lighting and they've been tired and hungry all day and there's emotional music and candles and this beautiful thing, there's also people that from, let's say, a Buddhist background are going to have their prayer ceremonies are going to be in darkness with candles. They're going to be chanting something after potentially, in many places, hiking for a long period of time or fasting, and they report the same supernatural experience. So once again, we're not saying people don't find it meaningful. It's just that we seem to be able to explain all of the relevant data from a natural perspective, and that sacraments only work insofar as you believe that they work, or phrased differently, that you make the sacraments real with your belief. The next point here is that the church imposes endless rules and conditions for sacraments. And so, like we said, the average Catholic might not understand just how complex, like the general instruction for the Roman Missal, just on the Masses.
Yes.
Or just how many controversies throughout 2,000 years there have arisen around if a priest is starting Mass and passes away halfway through, at what point do you have to pick back up in this particular set of prayers? Or what even are the mandatory words? In a good example of this, there's a controversy in, I think it was the mid-2010s with the We Believe controversy, where...
You mean we baptize?
We baptize, not we believe. Credo and unum Deum. But we baptize. So when a Catholic's baptized, the saying is generally, "I baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost," or Spirit, which is right out of the Bible. There was a particular community of Catholics in the Midwest that instead of saying, "I baptize," the priest, actually I think it was a deacon, said, "We baptize." And you're like, And then he said all of the rest of the words correct. And then later on, there was a priest who had been baptized that way, had then been ordained, and had been living his ministry out, and all of a sudden went to rewatch his baptism. I believe is how he went to rewatch it, or somebody told him, and they checked, and it turns out, instead of saying, the deacon saying, "I baptize you," he said, "We baptize you," and the Vatican had this long controversy and basically said, turns out your priest was never validly baptized. It turns out that he was never technically, like if we wave our wand, our soul scanner wand, that never happened. And so all of his sacraments that required him to be a priest for never happened.
Because certain sacraments require others. Like you need to be baptized before any other sacrament will work. So if his baptism was invalid, that means his ordination was invalid. That means every sacrament that he did, every Eucharist he performed, every confession he heard, every baptism, baptism works fine. But anything that he had done was somehow, it hadn't actually worked according to the theology.
And all because, not because the deacon intended something different, not because the deacon failed to even do a baptism. It wasn't for any other reason other than
one word
saying, "We baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. And when he should have said, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And there's a bunch of rebuttals, but I think the central issue here is that if you can go your entire life as a faithful member of the church, to be ordained, to live this quote-unquote supernatural life of grace, and it turns out all of it was fake, it seems like it just comes down to belief at the end of the day.
And as I said before, Catholics will always say that God is sovereign and can give grace whenever and however he wants. And so they may say, well, those people probably did receive the grace of the sacrament because it wasn't their fault. The problem is that seems to undermine the need of the sacraments to be efficacious in themselves as actual channels of grace. Which is an interesting discussion. But yeah, it's an issue of having this hyper specificity and this sort of, well, it was valid or it wasn't valid based on one word difference.
Decades later,
this priest and everyone that he ministered to, I'm sure, felt grace and God and meaning and power from the sacraments in their lives. And yet, according to the church, none of that was actually efficacious. Any grace they received was sort of by exception or special dispensation from God directly. So,
yeah. Or I think of my confirmation class at an average parish. Confirmation, for people listening, is kind of around middle school, high school age in the Roman Church in America, where it's kind of, you were baptized when you were younger, and then confirmation is this kind of like continuation of baptism, this like passage into adulthood.
It kind of feels like equivalent to the Protestant like profession of faith idea. It's like, it's me as an adult, I am choosing this for my life, you know.
And it's seen as this indelible mark, which once again means that it's not just a formal ceremony where you're like, I'm an adult now, I'm making my decision, and this is special because I'm making the decision. It's that it's special because of that, but more importantly, that you, Colin, if I'm the bishop and I confirm you, you now have more grace in your soul. You have the Holy Spirit dwelling with you. You have
gifts.
The 7 gifts. You have all of these things, like objectively speaking. And I remember before my own confirmation reading into this essentially guidebook of all of the sacraments, and you can't that mark on your soul can't be put in there if you haven't been to confession for a particular mortal sin. Which is like, once again, then we got to explain there's sins like I stole a candy bar that like you can receive the sacraments, but God's going to be like upset, but like you're going to be fine. And then there's mortal sins that like you have to go to confession to a priest in particular, who you fingers crossed is ordained and can validly do it, as we talked about in the first controversy.
And then says the right absolution.
Yeah, and so all of these teenagers who aren't properly catechized, I assume, are going to have some sort of mortal sin on their soul. Now, what's a mortal sin is a separate video. But the point being, even though most of the people, they go to the cathedral, or actually Basilica in Minneapolis' case, there is the correct form, the correct matter, the correct intent by people who fully believe that they're being confirmed. If they had a mortal sin on their soul but hadn't been to confession before that happened, the thing is that it's not that it doesn't happen, it's that it kind of just like waits above your soul until you go to confession. Yeah, like pending payment. And then once you actually confirm it, or once you go to confession for that particular sin, then it gets applied in the confessional. And you're like, this is so convoluted, non-testable. It's absurd if you say it's literal. If you just say passage into adulthood, awesome. Like I'm on board. People think that, but these rules around the technicalities of it,
there's no way to measure it, and there's no sign of it working versus not working. There's no actual difference in your life or how it affects you. That's the contention. Because
you might think that you are confirmed, right? Colin could be. He could have the party afterwards. He can have Catholic grandma show up. He can go on going and doing evangelization after that and fully believe. And like technically, because he forgot to mention something in confession, it didn't technically happen. But then once he does go to confession at some point, but like you don't know that it happens.
Not exactly, because of the sort of knowledge requirement for mortal sins. But yes, I mean, it's the same. It's the same boat as someone who thought they were validly baptized and weren't actually baptized. Like you're going out there and you think you have the ability to be in a state of grace, but you don't actually, apparently, which should be a big deal. Like you should be able to notice that.
And it's definitionally non-falsifiable. Right? Because this dynamic of God works through the sacraments, but he can also work outside of them, means that we can't actually know how God works. We can't actually know anything. And so it becomes this cope where it's like, for example, the priest who turns out he was never technically Catholic because somebody messed up the words. But it's like, well, he could have, the people that went to him for confession, God could have forgiven them still, because his hands aren't tied to the sacraments, is such a cope, because now we don't have access to that. And now when you're receiving sacraments, you can't actually know with certainty. And so like my grand conspiracy theory is that it's technically possible that no sacrament ever has been performed. Meaning, like, if we can't actually know that sacraments happened, even if we can think there's visible effects to them, means that theoretically the church has gone on for 2,000 years without a single sacrament happening. Because if the original bishop somewhere in 150 AD slipped and fell and said the wrong words, then every bishop and every priest from beyond that point was never validly ordained. And this is like another micro niche. There's a group of Catholics who think that the current church has apostatized, which means the modern church is heretics. And that Pope Francis is so woke that he is self-selected, that he's no longer Catholic. And so there's actually these rival lines of ordination. And there are bishops who the Vatican has technically excommunicated. But because of, once again, these like technicalities of rules, as a bishop, you still have the right to ordain people. And it's valid. It's not licit because the church hasn't ordained it. But nonetheless, you can have a Catholic priest without even if you've been excommunicated. But then there's other sacraments that, like, it doesn't work that way. But there's all of these rival lines from, there's a few, there's like Pope Michael, which people might have heard about in
Palmarian Church.
Yeah, the Palmarian Church. There's the various Sedevacantists Church. There's the Thuc line of bishops, and even SSPX, where like they ordained their priests, and the Vatican has no choice but to say, like, technically these are real priests, but like you did it against the rules. But then other things, it's so complex that you're like, to go from maybe something happened at Jesus's resurrection to like the nuances of the particular types of supernatural graces applied both in permission and outside permission of a particular representative in the Vatican is like, yeah, we are so far.
You're so far from it. Yeah. It's for like Protestants example, there's like sort of the idea that there's the minimal facts that you have to, from these minimal facts, we can know that like the gospel is real, and from there, like, believe in our salvation through Christ. As Catholics, you have a much, much, much stronger, higher burden of proof, because you have all of these little particular things that are declared infallible and have all these like cascading butterfly effect consequences. To your point about the sort of conspiracy theory that there's never been any valid sacraments, I would argue that's not even a conspiracy theory. It's statistical, like, inevitability that given the fact that we know that at least like one or two priests have been invalidly baptized, and the fact that there weren't video cameras for the majority of Catholic history, it's almost a certainty that vast swaths of Catholic populations across time have not actually received valid sacraments, and that any grace they received was sort of by exception only, which sort of makes the sacraments seem false advertising, you know? Like, oh, okay, so why do we need these exactly? Why do we need all of the regulations?
And it's because it's a spider web, where if some bishop in the 400s did something wrong, all of his descendants with ordination, even if they do everything right, you just have to have one break, and then everything else, like fruit of the poisonous tree, everything else there is toast. Or for example, like this priest controversy, if he was then ordained a bishop, then he ordains the next generation of priests and the next generation after. And then you figure out that some humans said the wrong set of arbitrary sounds from their mouth, and because of that, God said no. And then, and so it's wild to, I mean, historically the church hasn't used English or even Latin, and that somehow God cares so thoroughly about what utterances his random human creation is throwing out there. Like there's an ordination controversy for this like rival line of bishops, where the person ordaining the next bishop thinks that he said the Latin too sloppy. Like he didn't enunciate and pronounce the words correctly. And so then, like, after this big ceremony in the back room, then they did a second conditional one. And you're like, are sacraments that dependent on, like, so what's the line of, like, proper pronunciation versus mumbling, I guess is there. And then our kind of, like, next critique here is that the sacraments have so wildly changed throughout the ages. That if we get, in Catholics nowadays, especially in culture wars, get so uptight about the proper way and the most fitting way to do sacraments, when in reality, these sacraments have changed so drastically. Just on marriage has meant so many different things. Is it a sacrament to begin with? Is a question out there. And then how particularly do you do it? And then what are the conditions? The Catholics have this huge logic chart of they both have to do essentially genital inspections and also supernatural claims about well, did you enter into a previous marriage? But then there's different shades of marriage, and then you have to play them all together. And then there's the church has this court system where if you don't know, then you go to the local marriage tribunal, which sounds dope as hell, right? A marriage tribunal, just like the name sounds cool. The idea of it, terrible. But there's all of these crazy determinations that they're don't have knowledge claims about. And then they've changed. Yeah, if you want to dive into
I mean it's just I can shout out Kevin Non-Trigoth.
Kevin, what's up?
Great channel. Just is doing a series right now. I'm assuming as we're filming this right now, where he's going through marriage as a sacrament and how that's been viewed through church history, and shows, I think, quite convincingly that marriage was not viewed as a sacrament. And honestly, that the idea of what a sacrament was not something that early church fathers even agreed upon.
Yeah.
The idea that there are these 7 mystical, efficacious rituals that Christ gave us that have a specific form and matter and intent, it's just not found until the Council of Trent, essentially, or shortly before. You can see how the idea develops from Scripture all the way to it, but the idea is not found in Scripture at all. And I guess that's where you get into the idea of development of doctrine, which is kind of a whole separate discussion. But in terms of the Council of Trent declaring infallibly that sacraments are only 7, have only ever been 7, have been instituted by Christ, and have a specific form and matter, it's hard to square with development of doctrine, because they're not saying, oh, we now understand that there are 7 sacraments, and we are formalizing them here. They're saying, no, retroactively, they've always been this way, which is an empirical claim that is not borne out by the data.
Well, and in, for example, confession. Nowadays, in, let's say, a traditional Catholic context, not even just a general American context, in a specifically American traditional Catholic context, confession is a very particular thing. It occupies a very particular space in spiritual life, that you have to confess a particular list of sins, and that you can go there both in a certain number of recommended times, but also not too many times, but also not too infrequently, and that it does these things. And then you look at just confession throughout the ages. In the early church, in some contexts, you were only allowed 1 confession in your life.
Your whole life.
Or 2. And then it seems like in the High Middle Ages, then it was it became this, we can go frequently. And all of a sudden you're wait, you can go frequently. But then the Eastern Church has a radically different understanding of confession and sin. And then you throw these things like indulgences on top, which is a super nuanced discussion. And every apologist, as soon as they hear indulgences, they have walls up. They got their, technically actually, and you have what is the Apostolic Penitentiary, which is the dicastery that even now formalizes indulgences and what are indulgences and what aren't indulgences. In somehow by decree of a particular guy in Rome, he can say reading scripture for 30 minutes a day is now a particular type of indulgence that's now accessible across the world. And so also these sacraments have this weird negotiation of, is this a decision that the Vatican made, or is this that's essentially arbitrary? Right? The Vatican wouldn't claim that a particular indulgence is ordained by God.
No.
But then also some of the things like the we believe or we baptize controversies, well, technically God said this one.
Yeah, they would. The Vatican's contention would be that they don't have the power to change the wording to "we baptize."
So they're kind of we're handcuffed here, but also we're making rules here that now God has to work through these things. And then it's almost like in Harry Potter when they go into the bank and there's all these gold coins. It's the Apostolic Penitentiary is this weird group in the Vatican that has this treasure trove of graces that the saints have merited, and then can kind of sit there and post stamp particular graces for particular actions and a buy one get one free type of way. And you're we're so far from...
It's very bureaucratic, very legalistic, and making extremely objective truth claims about the supernatural that are not testable, are not falsifiable, are not backed up by anything, even historical evidence.
Because if they made the modest claim not to pump up the Protestants too much here, but you go to your local evangelical church that's going to play Hillsong, and then like something special happens here, but like it's because we believe, and like we don't really know exactly what happens here, but like something happens, and that's a very like modest claim.
Yeah.
And so when you're like, yeah, like I probably agree from a secular perspective, like something special to people happens,
Yeah.
is a very different claim than like if you do this particular ritual in this particular way, these particular things will objectively happen.
Yeah.
And we not just think this is a hypothesis, but like we know this. And then a lot of Catholics probably aren't ready for this last point, is that sacraments resemble ritual magic more than anything else.
Well, they don't resemble ritual magic. They are ritual magic. I mean, anthropologically. So if you're looking at anthropologically, what does magic mean? It's doing actions, ritual actions, to sort of affect the supernatural in some way, or to cause a supernatural change. Every society, wearing your favorite sports jersey because you think it's the jersey that, if you don't wear it, your favorite sports team is going to lose. That is a magical ritual, anthropologically speaking. Doing a certain set of prescribed particular actions to achieve a supernatural outcome, or even a natural outcome, where it's not like where you do science, where you're like, okay, I'm doing X, Y, and Z because I have observed or I suspect that will be the outcome. From a magical perspective, it's sort of a seemingly arbitrary set of actions, words, movements, whatever you use, that will achieve a certain outcome, whether supernatural or natural. That's what the sacraments are. They're just a type of magic. Now, from the Catholic perspective, the word magic is very loaded, because they'll say, well, no, magic is only when it's demonic, which is, as Dan McClellan likes to say, it's just boundary maintenance. What you're doing is you're saying, okay, there's a bunch of supernatural actions I can take, and we're going to have a group of actions that are allowable and a group of actions that aren't allowable, and we're going to sort of declare that these ones are magic and these ones aren't, when in reality they both function identically. The only difference is one of them is your group's actions and the other one is another group's actions.
Well, because they like to differentiate between supernatural and preternatural, because a faithful Catholic won't just condemn, let's say, a Ouija board because you're doing something from the other guy's team. It's that like Ouija boards are real, and this is going back to Colin and I's episode on the demonic, but that like magic exists and like it's real, and it's not just this fake made up thing like a sin, like burning an American flag. It's that like you actually, when you're doing the Ouija board, like things are happening, and that like witches, like Catholics will go on and on about how witches aren't just like doing foo-foo things. Like the witches are actually doing magic because they have their same counter rituals. Yeah. And so they'll admit that like, oh, witches have power and these things have power, but also our ones have power, but your power comes from demons.
It's just our team, your team. You know, it's who are you using? When in reality, it's the exact same process. From an anthropological perspective, Catholicism isn't privileged in some way. Like the Catholic God and his rituals aren't categorically different from others in some special way, unless you already accept that the Catholic God is the one true God and everything else is false. Like you have to buy into the premise to say that, well, no, the sacraments aren't actually magical or anything. So from our perspective as non-Catholics or non-practicing Catholics, whatever your definition, all religions are sort of making the same unfalsifiable, untestable claims about the supernatural. They all function the same way. They all use magic from an anthropological perspective in the same ways. You just are saying mine's different because I believe it's true.
When that unfalsifiable element, I always use the example of when I was younger, my brothers would say when I'm brushing my teeth that there's a monster in the bathtub. But every time I looked backwards, he would go into the drain. And you're like, so it's definitionally unfalsifiable because if I'm looking and see nothing, it means that he's already moved out of the way. And when I'm not looking, he could be there because I'm not looking that way. And mirrors count. And so in the Catholic world, there's two unfalsifiable elements. One, if it is efficacious, but it's not the correct one, we can just say it's from the devil. That the Hindus might have miracle claims or might have efficacicious things that they do, but it's from the other team.
Correct.
But then the other unfalsifiable element is that if, for example, we believe, or I keep saying we believe, we baptize, is like we can't actually know because God could have just came in and filled in the gaps when we weren't looking because we believed. And then they'll say, well, like grace can only be applied insofar as the believer is open to it. And that's why somebody who's not particularly Catholic but receives the sacraments aren't going to have an effect because they weren't open to it.
Right.
And so, but it's really just an issue. But like if you were really open, you'd see an effect. And that's our point, which is it seems like only insofar as somebody believes they have a particular experience that changes their daily life.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, essentially. And from an outside perspective, just analyzing religions as an idea and how they function, Catholicism doesn't function differently to other religions. I think a lot of Catholics have this idea that they're somehow very unique or special because of X, Y, or Z, but especially when it comes to the sacraments, it's not. Like so this is something I wanted to bring up. Like a lot of the sacraments make sense anthropologically. Like confession's useful because it encourages pro-social behavior because you are saying these certain things are bad, don't do them. And you're going to have to tell someone about them, which is kind of embarrassing. So an incentive not to. It also provides a pathway for people who would otherwise be like crushed with guilt to say like, okay, no, I can resolve to do better and improve my life. And so I always thought of it as almost like a sort of proto-therapy, you know? So like I can see anthropologically why it's a useful social tool. Same with like the Eucharist, you know, you're doing a group community ritual. There's this idea in magical rituals of sort of, well, I mean, eating things is like extremely common. I mean, even in Catholicism, I know a lot of people will say this flippantly and Catholics get annoyed, but the sort of ritual cannibalism aspect of it is an important part of the ritual. Like, no, you're not literally doing like cannibalism because you believe the accidents are bread and wine, but you are spiritually like fully on board with the idea of, yes, I am consuming the body and the soul of God in order to take his power into myself, which is a very old anthropological understanding of magic. You know, I mean, even like the idea of like eating your enemy's heart to get his strength, or eating even in the Old Testament, they would talk about, you know, like the priests would eat the food offerings that they were burned to God, because it's like the idea is like these men are pure enough. These are like it's you know it's a whole common ritual trope across different religious ideas. You see it in ancient Greek religion, all sorts of things. The Mithraic cults also had food rituals that they would do. It's a very common, because like what is more fundamentally human and social than eating together? I mean, it makes sense. So I think in marriage, like, of course you want a sort of way to make marriage meaningful, because it's a way to make, you know, it's all of these sacraments make sense from an anthropological point of view, why they would be beneficial to a society, to a group. So there's not like, there just isn't anything unique or unexplainable or strange about them in any sense, whether from like a historical, anthropological, you know, how they affect people. It's all very, no, mundane sounds mean. They're beautiful. They're wonderful. I think the Mass is a great example of ritual technology. It understands why ritual is important, what makes ritual work, and what's good about it. Like, I could go on forever about it, but I I think that Catholics are they're wearing a little bit of blinders if they think that it's unique.
Well, a good example of this is I do a lot of ultra marathons, and it's not that they're not meaningful to people. It's not that there are rituals, whether it's the start line or the course or the cutoffs or the rules. And a great example is there's a big race in Hawaii that I've helped at. And all of the trails are publicly accessible, but yet there's a lottery to get in. So like technically you could go run the trails and it's not illegal. But what makes it special is that you have been selected, you've met the requirements, you've been ordained by the leadership to be there. And that there's a very specific start line, and there's a ritual around the start line, and there's rules, and it's real. But by virtue of it being real doesn't mean that we don't know how it happens. It's that the race organizer said this is the start time, and that you have to complete this arduous race in a particular time, and people are rushing to cutoffs. And it's not that they dive in as cutoffs. It's not that the trails magically disappear after the cutoffs. It's just then you don't get the recognition, you don't get that on your resume, you don't get to have the award at the end and can't tell people that you did this particular thing. And so like we said at the beginning of the episode, to say that Catholic sacraments are natural doesn't mean that your experience of them is bad, or that you're dumb for finding meaning in them, or that nobody should ever have rituals.
Oh no, yeah.
It's that we all make rituals out of our lives. We all have social conventions and groups that we're a part of that have particular things that make it all special. But the central point being, we create the meaning, not that the meaning is this supernatural, unexplainable, something that is so crazy that we have nothing left in our arsenal but to say, your experience of adoration is because God said so.
Right. Yeah, 100%.
And so, yeah, I feel like we went through...
Yeah, we got through all those points.
Yeah, and so that wraps us up at the end of the episode. Well, we've got through all of that in 50-ish minutes. That's impressive. But yeah, so we're not telling you what to do. We're not telling you what to think. Just be careful, and especially don't use sacraments to bludgeon people, to guilt trip family members into doing things, to denigrate other people's rituals. If you want to do it, cool, but also be okay with other.
Well, yeah. Here's a case. Like, I think sacraments are honestly great. They're if they bring you meaning and purpose, that's awesome. Use them the way that they're best used, which is as a pro-social, inviting, collective experience of, like community solidarity and joy. Don't force people to participate in them. Don't get super legalistic about them. If they bring you happiness, that's great. Yeah. Invite people to experience that with that, sure, but don't like drag your gay son who doesn't want to go to church just because you think it'll fix him. It won't. Or
get a lot of traditional Catholics get worked up about what are the conditions for you to receive Holy Communion. Yes. Like, what things do you have to do and say in order to like partake in eating the bread? And if you do it in the wrong way, you're actually like throwing more guilt onto your soul.
Yeah, I would say the majority of my like age of reason Catholic life, I did not receive just because of like the paranoia that is given to you about being in a proper state of grace when you receive and all this sort of stuff. And
there's a Catholic priest who went viral and for essentially saying, because Protestants don't have this convoluted, complex system of ritual power and authority being passed down, that the Spirit of God isn't in the Protestant churches, which, as somebody who doesn't believe in a supernatural God, like, I'm not worked up in the fact that like he's saying that the Protestants don't have God, but it's this arbitrary boundary maintenance and shame for other people for not having the correct way of doing things and denigrating their experience, when I think the average Protestant in the other church is going to tell just as many wonderful tales about how they felt the presence of the divine at a church summer camp or when their pastor came to their child's hospital bed. In the same way that the Catholic's going to talk about their priest ordained their marriage in a particular way and gave them particular advice. In the same way that the Buddhist is going to be in the mountains and put up these beautiful prayer flags to help them on their expedition. In the same way that that's somebody who's it's just like all these religions do things, so let's stop bludgeoning each other with something that's not unique to your particular religion. And yeah, you can, support this on Patreon, makes all of this in this studio possible. All this stuff
isn't... Join his Discord.
Yeah, join my Discord. Yeah, if you want to talk about this more and kind of work through these, join our Discord. We're on there, and lots of spiritual support tickets, as I say, people join.
Oh yeah.
And if you're a Catholic who wants to grill us on something, shoot me an email. Let's have a dialogue. As long as you want to have a good faith discussion, I talk to just about anybody under the sun. So grill me, debate me, do a reaction video, and we'll go from there. So we're signing off. Lots of other podcasts, and we'll talk to you guys in the next one.
Peace.
Oh,
that was awesome.
Under an hour?
That was pretty great. Literally 15